Thanks for the nice introduction, Hampus, because then I don't have to introduce you to a couple of things that I will show later in the talk. I was asked to cover a bit the experimental part of FAIRmat with respect to machine learning and AI that we have been doing. I think a lot of you people will be working in theory and doing machine learning for that, but we will also have a bit of discussion about AI and machine learning and experimental data. So what I'm working on in FAIRmat is I'm working in Area B, which is the experimental side. But additionally, I'm also shared postdoc at the MPI for chemical energy conversion, 2 towns over in Mülheim. And what we are interested there in experimentally is X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, which is a technique where you basically hit your sample with an X-ray beam and you measure the energy of the outgoing electrons. And if you analyze the spectra that you get out of these, you can obtain quantification or quantitative analysis of the different phases that you have in your material. So the way that you typically do this is by peak fitting using combinations of Gaussian and Lorentzian functions. So here I have one example for an iron spectrum where we used different metallic and iron oxide phases to obtain quantifications for these different chemical phases, essentially by doing these peak fits. So what you can see already from this plot is that this peak fitting can be quite complicated. I intentionally made it much more complicated than it necessarily has to be, but it can be quite complicated in this case. And the problem with these quantifications is that sometimes you have either poor data quality or you have large data sets. And in this particular case, we have problems with overlapping peak shapes. We can have translational shifts because we can have charging and one calibrations and so on. And we can have noisy data and the resolution can change. So often we see that in the literature, especially for these very complex transition metal oxide spectra, we can have errors up to 10 to 20% in the quantification. So that's not all that nice if you want to do very quantitative in the end. And also, if you do such a peak fit, it can be very hard to transfer this model across different spectra and instruments. And this is a problem for us because we do a lot of XPS measurements also for external partners, and we would want to automate this a little bit so that we don't actually have to do the analysis for them all the time. So what we set out to do in a couple of years ago is sort of build an auto-quantifier for XPS spectra, especially for mixed metal oxides. And the way we started doing this is using a convolutional neural network. So the basic idea is that you have here your spectrum basically as a vector input to your neural network. I'll show a bit about the architecture afterwards. And then the output is essentially a vector where we have the quantification of the different phases as a percentage, as you would also get from the peak fitting. And then obviously you want to train this neural network by backpropagation in a standard way. And for this, you need spectra where we know the labels for the training. The problem really is, this is actually what we want to do in the end, right? So in order to get training data with known labels, we would have to simulate them from the beginning because we can't do this from experimental data because in the literature itself we have the large error as I described before. So what we did essentially is that we started by measuring lots of reference data, and we can do this very easily with our XPS setup that we have in Mülheim because this also has ambient pressure capabilities, so we can also measure a lot of these intermediate phases. And then after we have done this for a couple different metal and oxide spectra, we essentially just did linear combinations of these. And then we also started simulating a bit of experimental effects. So first we started to shift these spectra on the x-axis to simulate a bit of charging and changes in the calibration of the spectrometer and so on. Then we introduced artificial noise. Essentially Poisson noise is also, it's the case in XPS anyway. Then we introduced artificial broadening of the spectra to simulate different instrument parameters and so on. And then also, because we're interested in this ambient pressure capabilities of XPS, we also simulated what happens if you measure the spectrum while you have a gas phase present, because essentially then the electrons get scattered and the spectrum gets a bit distorted. So out of all of this, when we do these linear combinations, we can get large amount of synthetic XPS spectra, which look similar to what we have in the lab, but where we know the actual composition. So here we see a different example, different set of examples for iron. And this we can then use for training such neural networks. So essentially, the neural network that we are using is relatively simple, especially compared to what we have seen in the last couple of years with these LLMs and so on. But still, it works. And I still think it's nice to use also these sort of simpler ideas that have been developed in the last 10, 15 years or so. So what we're using is a relatively shallow convolutional neural network where we have in the first layer different parallel one-dimensional convolutions where we use different kernel sizes. And this essentially allows us to learn both from small and also long-range spectral correlations. So for example, we can learn here the shape of the peak, but also how this peak is related to other peaks in the spectra as well. And then by using a softmax activation, we essentially already get out this percentage that we want to learn in the end. So convolutional neural networks also help us a lot with this shifting on the x-axis because they are inherently invariant to essentially to shifting. So this is already a problem that we can cover quite easily. So then what we did is essentially we used the training data that I presented earlier and just trained on these and then also did the validation on these. As you can see, the loss function goes down for all of these. But what we also see is that depending on the material, so for example for manganese here, the loss actually decreases much less, and also in the test data we see, this is here, it's maybe a bit hard to see, but we see that the average mean absolute area for the test data is also much broader for manganese. And this is the case because the manganese spectra itself are very similar to each other. So for example, manganese oxide and manganese 2O3 are so similar to each other that it's very hard to distinguish these. But this is actually nice because also for experimentalists, these would be hard to distinguish. So the neural network sort of mirrors what we would get also for experimental analysis. But for some of these materials, it works actually very nice. So for example, for nickel or for iron, we get very nice results. And then what we also did is, because earlier I talked a bit about the peak fitting that people have been doing traditionally, is that we then used the set of or subset of the training data that we worked on, and then also did a bit of the analysis in a traditional way. So we used 3 different approaches for fitting these data, which have also been sort of reported in the literature. So this is the fit according to the most cited reference, which essentially calculates the different peaks that you can have here. Then we also did a manual peak fitting model. You see here already this fit doesn't look too well in the end. And then what we also did is similar to actually what the neural network does, is that we used the fit with the reference line shapes. So essentially you just use the reference line shapes and then did a linear combination of these. However, if we compare all of these fitting results to the neural network analysis, which you see here on the right-hand side, and then we do a bit of statistics, we see that the neural network actually outperforms almost all of these, especially this fit, which is according to the most cited literature for XPS fitting, which is a bit surprising to us. We see that the reference line shape fits actually work quite well. Where they fail, however, is once you start broadening the spectra quite a bit because, you cannot really broaden these reference spectra in a way that they would fit data that is broadened in a different way than they were when they were measured. So essentially the neural network is able to at least perform as well as all the techniques that have been referenced in the literature. However, all of this has obviously been done on the synthetic data, so you could start and say, yeah, okay, this is now the data that the neural network has been trained on. Obviously, it's better than all of the other data that people have been working on. So what we started to do, I mean, we haven't really finished with this, that we got data, but also analyzed data from different experienced users from the community. And essentially, they provided us with the data, but also with the analysis. And then we ran the neural network on the same data to see how well the fit is compared to what they have been doing and what neural network predicts. So here's one example. This is also an iron spectrum where what is shown here as real is essentially the analysis that the user or the experimentalist performed, and then the prediction is the one that the neural network gives out. And in this particular case, the vectors match quite well. And also, if we do a bit of statistics on these, we see that so here on the x-axis, we essentially see the mean absolute error and how many of these are above a certain threshold. And we see that I would say if you have 0.1 mean absolute error, that's about 10% off in your in the fitting that you perform, and the neural network is able to fit to about 75% of what the people have been doing there in the community. So it does work quite well also for data that the neural network has not seen before. There's obviously a bit still for room for improvement, but here we also have to see that these are very experienced users, so they really know what they're doing. But we also want to be able to make this neural network available for all kinds of users who have maybe never actually touched a data fitting analysis software. So this also works quite nicely for all kinds of users. What we also then try to do is, so initially we only used one set of elements for each neural network. The problem is often in our setups we have data where we have samples which contain different materials, like nickel, cobalt, and iron, for example, is a typical heterogeneous catalyst that we use in the lab. And there you cannot really do this one-by-one fitting anymore, because just natively, so for example, if we look at the nickel metal spectrum here, it has an Auger peak here right in the region where we also have the iron 2p spectrum. So we have a native overlap between Auger signal and XPS signal. So we always have to analyze these in combination. So what we did then is we created essentially new training sets, linearly combining all of these in the whole range essentially. And then we trained a new neural network which can do quantification of multiple elements and also the phases within these multiple elements at the same time. And also here we ran a bit the comparison to peak fitting, which essentially we did again through linear combinations of the reference. And also here the neural network sort of outperforms, or at least performs as well as the peak fitting analysis. So this is also very helpful for people, especially in our institute where we have a lot of these combined materials. Another thing that is obviously of interest is how certain is the neural network. And here we can use a method called variational inference, where we use the dropout layers, which are typically used only during training to selectively set a set of the neural network weights to 0 to prevent overfitting. But these you can also then use during inference, and which essentially means you always sample a subset of your neural network while you do the inference. And if you do this a couple of times, you get also statistics of how the neural networks performs if you set these dropout layers to 0 sort of randomly. And then this tells you a bit about how certain the neural network is in its prediction. So here we have 3 different spectra. So the blue one, this is also again on iron, is a spectrum where the neural network is able to perform very well, because it's you don't have a lot of noise, don't have a lot of broadening, it's very easy to perform. And we see here, if you do these prediction histograms, that the prediction for the different phases, this is actually on nickel, sorry. But here we see metallic nickel and nickel oxide, and the prediction is always the same, independent of which layers you turn off using this dropout method. But then if we go to this yellow spectrum, we see that we have a lot of noise, and this essentially means the neural network has a harder time to analyze this. And this we also see that the prediction histogram gets a bit broadened, and essentially the neural network gets less certain about its prediction. And then what's very interesting is here this green curve. Maybe it's a bit hard to see, but here in this part and also on this side, we introduced an artificial peak, which a neural network has never seen before. And in this case, the neural network gets very uncertain. So it basically is not able to predict anything with any certainty anymore. And this is very interesting because we are typically also interested in these non-standard phases where we can see we have an additional phase that we may not know just from the literature. And this is then of interest, for example, for catalysis, where we have this non-standard and non-stoichiometric phases. So this can be sort of also used if you have a huge stack of data and you want to find one spectrum where we have this, these additional phases. We can sort of do this as a needle in the hay analysis. And this we are using also for some of our data where we measure a lot, and then we try to find these phases which are of interest, and then we can go and do the manual analysis by themselves. So this was mostly now what we did in terms of neural network analysis. I will also talk now a bit how we integrate these into NOMAD. I would say this is still sort of, we just started with this, so it's not really widely available, but I will just show how we do this in the end. So as Hampus already pointed out, within the experimental area, we have been working a lot with this Nexus standard, which essentially is a metadata standard for describing the data, or a standard for describing the data and the metadata that you acquired in your experiments. And for XPS specifically, we have a defined standard now for describing such XPS experiment, but also the peak fitting analysis that you get in the end. So when you upload data to NOMAD, you can already see, so XPS data to NOMAD, you can already visualize all of the peak fitting and also all the metadata that we have there. And this is then obviously very nice to compare to the neural network that we are also running. And what also is helpful, that since Nexus provides you with a community agreed standard, this allows also all kinds of tools to work with these data, because they know how to interpret the data structure. So within NOMAD, we can run different tools, as Sampos already outlined. So for example, locally, we can also run Casa XPS, which is like the typical XPS analysis software, which is, again, proprietary, but in your local NOMAD Oasis, you can run this if you want to by yourself. And then for the neural network analysis that I presented in the earlier part of the talk, we can also then run these directly on the data in NOMAD, so we can have the data uploaded to NOMAD. Since we allow large files, we can even upload the models to NOMAD, and then we can use this Jupyter Hub within North to directly run these notebooks on the data that we have there, using the models that we have also uploaded. So then you really don't need to download the data, you don't need to download the models, you can do all of this directly in NOMAD. And then also what we provide, I mean, this is still very much in development, is an interactive search app for both the data sets that we can train on, but also for the models that have been trained on, and then you can use this for yourself as well. So yeah, in summary, we have been using CNNs for automated XPS quantification, using training sets, which we basically generated ourselves on well-characterized reference data. These CNNs have a quantification accuracy which is rather similar to experiments. At least for unexperienced users, they can be very helpful. For experienced users which do very complicated analysis, they may have to do this still manually. And then also I showed a bit about how this Monte Carlo dropout methods provides a quantification of model uncertainty. And then also these models are available in NOMAD, and you can try them out yourself. Thanks a lot.